Today's daf is daf Samach Aleph, and we'll give a little bit of an introduction. We had the case of a man who was Makadesh and Ishal Atnai, that she will find that he has a base core of offer, meaning that he's in possession of a piece of karka that is the size of a base core. But as it turns out, part of the base core is not royal Izriya. And the question is whether the Tanai was Mekuyim, or do we need a full base core, all of which is royal Izriya. And the Gemara is going to stretch its arm out to another area of Torah halacha in order to make an analogy. And that is a parsha in Vayikra Perek Chaf Vav. And that's the parsha of Magdish Steachuza. So a man inherits B'Yerusha a Sadeh, and we're talking specifically at the time that Yovel is Noeg. And the question is, after he was Magdish the Sadeh, how much does he have to put down on the table, how much money, in order to be poda that Sadeh and remove its status of Hegdesh? And the Torah says, Zerach Chomer Sa'orim B'chamishim Shekel Kosef. Now, we're going to divide up that pasuk into two parts. First part is Zerach Chomer Sa'orim, and that tells you what size is this Sadeh, and it's the size in which you could plant a Chomer Siorim, and this is called a base kur. The second part of the pasuk says B'chamishim shekel kosef. So that base kur of a steachuz that he was magdish, he's poded with 50 shekel. And what that means is the Torah is establishing an absolute objective shear of Pidiyah, and it makes no difference whether that karka is actually sellable on the market for that price of 50 shekel. It doesn't matter. Let's say it could go for 60 shekel, or it would only be sold for 40 shekel. It doesn't make any difference. And this din of pidyon is very unique because the opposite of this din pidyon is what's called lefi shavyo. Normally, when we podeh hegdesh, it's lefi shavyo. We go out and we evaluate it on the market. But here, it's a flat, absolute fee of 50 shekel kesef, as long as the field has the dimensions of zerach homer sora, which means a base kur. So we're going to begin now Daf Samach Aleph, but first 3 words from Samach Amid Beis. Gabe Hegdesh Tnan. We're going to analyze a Mishnah in Masechet Erchin on Daf Chaf Hey. And here we turn to Samach Aleph. Adam, a person was Magdish Sadeu B'Shnas Hayovel, B'Shas Hayovel. In other words, during the period of time that Yovel is Noeg, there are many dinim about when Yovel is Noeg. Now he wants to be poda the Sada that he was Magdish. No saying B'Zerach Homer Sorim, if the shetach of this Sada is plantable for a Chomer Sorim, which means it's a base kur, then he has to be poded on 50 shekel kesef. The Mishnah goes on now to address what's called a karka of nekayim or sloim. What's the difference between nekayim and sloim? Nekayim are gumos that are subterranean in the karka, and sloim are boulders that are above the karka. And if the karka has these nekayim or sloim, then ein nibdadim ima. What does that mean? First of all, let's emphasize what's the minimum shear of nekayim or Sloim for our context? And the answer is Asara Tfachim. So you've got gumos, okay, that are, like deep crevices and cavities in the karka that are a minimum of 10 tfachim deep, or you have boulders above the karka that rise up asar tfachim. These two areas, the area of Nekoim and of Sloim, are not included in the Shir Padiyah, meaning you'll be poda all the field with Chamishim Kesef, with the exception of these Nekoim and Sloim. They fall back into the universal rule of Padiyas Hegdesh, which is Lefi Niftim Lefi Shavyam. Now you might ask me, why would anyone purchase, let's say, Nekoim in a karka? And the answer is that the Nekoim in the karka are so deep that they can function as, let's say, cisterns of water when the water collects in these Nekoim. Well, let's say in the case of Sloim that rise up above the surface of the karka, they also have a certain value on the market. Pachos mikan, however, if the Nekoim or the Sloim are less than asar tfachim, then imdadim ima, and then they are included in the Padiyah of Chamishim Shekel Kesef. They did not remove themselves as an independent karka. It's part of the general karka. And the Gemara now wants to explain the reason why, if there were 10 tfachim, then the Nekoim have to be evaluated and redeemed lefi shavyon, not together with the karka itself. Havinamba, nehida bahadi aralo kachu. Okay, fine. I'm going to concede that it's logical that you cannot measure the Nekoim together with the Sada and consider them part of the Shetach HaSada because they're 10 tfachim deep or high. But nevertheless, Nigdishu bi'api nafshayu. Why not consider them a separate piece of karka? And with regard to karka, we're going to be poda the karka based on the principle of Zerach Chomer Sa'orim b'chamishim Kesef. And why does it fall back into the general category of Niftim B'Shavyan? B'chitema. And if you'll argue, Kama Delo Havi base car, maybe because these Nekoim or Sloim do not come to the sheer base car, which is equal of Zera Chomer Siorim, and therefore they cannot be subject to the Padiyah that applies to a Zerach Chomer Sorim. They're too small of an area. Uraminu, but I'm going to prove to you that that's not so. And that if you could separate these areas and they emerge as separate independent entities, then despite the fact that they don't reach the volume, the Shetach of base core, they still are subject to the Padiyah of Chamishim Kesef and not to the general Padiyah Lefi Shavim. Because we have a brisa that interprets the word Sada in the Pasuk Vayikra Chav Zayin. It says, V'im mistei achuzaso yakdish ish lashem, and the word stay is superfluous. It could have just said V'im achuzaso yakdish ish lashem. Umat Talmud Lomar, why did the Torah add the word sada or stay? And the Gemara explains, the Brisa explains, Lafisha never, because in the very same pasuk it says Zerach Chomer Sorim b'chamishim shekel kesef. Ainli ela kishehigdish be'inyan hazeh. I would interpret that the din of Padiyah of Chamishim Kesef only applies to Zerach Chomer Siorim, meaning only to a field that has the dimensions of a base core, and therefore, kishehigdish be'inyan hazeh. Minayin l'rabos, how do I know that the halacha of chamishim kesef for pidyon of someone who's magdish de'achuza applies even in cases where you don't have a base kur. Minayin l'rabos lesach, which is half a kur, chatzi lesach, which is a quarter of a kur, and sa'ah o tirkav, which is a chatzi sa v'chatzi tarka, v'afilu rova tarka. Minayin tamalomer stay. The Torah added the superfluous word stay to be marbe any size of a stay achuza that he was magdish to be included under the halacha of pidyon chamishim shekel kesef mikol makom. So therefore, we see clearly from this brisa explicitly that even a karka that has a shear katan, which is not up to par, doesn't have the shear of a base kur, nevertheless it's nifta according to the shear of chamishim kesef. And therefore we go back to ask our question, which now stands firm, namely that even if you don't evaluate these nekoim and sloim together with the karka, but nevertheless they should be candidates or defined as a separate field. Each one is a separate field. And although it's not a base core, it doesn't matter. The halacha of chamishim kesef applies even if it's not a base core. And the Gemara answers, Amar Ukva Bar Chama Hacha b'nekoim b'lei mayim askina. When the Torah says that there's a pediyah of chamishim shekel kesef, the Torah, the Torah makes a condition on the fact that it's zera, chomer, siorim. Let's emphasize the word zera. The word zera means that it's Gvadi royal Israel. But what are we talking about here? Nekoim that are full with water, and therefore there's no possibility of planting in these Nekoim. Delav bars rianinu. And therefore you would not apply the shear of Padiyah of Chamishim Kesef because it's not zera, chomer, siorim. Zera means royal Israel. And therefore, b'meila, the Padiyah of this area of Nekoim, Maleim, Mayin, which are not Ru'im Israel, fall into the general universal category of Padiyah Lefi Shavya. And they will be redeemed and evaluated under a separate category, not together with the entire Sad. Dekonami, the one wants to prove this from the words of the Mishnah. In one breath, the Mishnah and Erchen presents both Nekoim and Slime. And in the case of Slime are not Ru'il Lizriya. They're tough as a rock, right? They are stones, boulders. And therefore it's logical that even Nekoim that is mentioned in the same breath is Nekoim She'ef Shel Azarim, which means what? That they are full with water. Shma Mina, and that's how we're going to derive it. If this be the case that any royal Israel is nifta v'shavya, is afilu pachas mikan nami. Let's say you have Nekoim and Slime that are less than asar tfachim, and we should come to the conclusion that they're not nimdad together with the sada to be subject to the p'ti of chamishim shekel, but rather they should be padui b'shavya, because at the end of the day they're not royal Israel. So the stipulation and the precondition for the special unique p'ti of chamishim kesef, namely that's going to be royal Israel, is not fulfilled, even if the slime and the nekoim are less than 10 tefachim. And the Gemara answers, Hanu nagne di aramiku. These are like the bowls of the karka. Like you have a bowl of kara, which is called agonos, and the slime that are less than asar tefachim are shidra di aramiku. They are like extensions or protrusions of a karka. So you see that they are called al shem karka. They don't separate themselves as a makom chashuv fnei atzmam, but rather they're bottled to the karka. And therefore the din of pediyah is the sheer pediyah for zerach chomer siorim if it's less than 10 tefachim, even though it's not royal Israel, and that's b'chamishim kesef. Now the Gemara wants to compare this by analogy to mechiras karka. Gabi mecher tanan, we learned in the Mishnah Baba Basra Kuf Beis. Ha'omer l'chaver beis kur ofar ani mocher l'cha. I'm selling you a base kur of karka. V'hayisham nekayim amukim asar tefachim o sloim gvoim asar tefachim ein nimdadim ima. If the mocher has to cough up, has to come across for the benefit of the lokeach with a base kur, he cannot integrate the very deep nikoyim and the very high sloim into the calculation of a base kur. Unless pachos mikan, if these are less than 10 tvachim deep or 10 tvachim high, then imdadim ima. Then they are considered part of the field that's being sold, the karka, the real estate that's being sold, and they can now contribute and be integrated with the shear of base kur. So far, we're doing well. But Omer Mar Ukva Bar Chama, with regard to those Nekayim Amukim Yosem Asar Tfachim that are not considered part of the karka, and they cannot be contributors to integrate into the shear of base kur, Afal Pisha Ein Malei Mayim. If it's Ein Malei Mayim, then it's Royal Izriya. And now we see in front of us a contrast between two sets of halachas. One set of halacha is Pedia with regard to Magdish Stei Achuza, and the other set of halachas with regard to Mechira. In the case of Pedia, when we say that Asar Tfachim or more separates itself and is Niftal Fi Shavyo, that was because it was Mole Mayim, or in the case of Sloim where you can't plant anything. Here we're saying that if these Nekayim are deeper than Asar Tfachim, they're not part of the karka, they cannot constitute and contribute to the shear of a base kur to validate this mechira, even though, Mar Ukva says, even though they have no water in them. And if they have no water, they efshar bizriya. So you see that even something that's efshar lizroa, nevertheless, it cannot be considered part of the karka to set up a base kur, which is the exact opposite of what we said in Hegdish. My timer, what's the logical reason why, even if you could be zorea in these nekayim, nevertheless they cannot contribute to be mashal in the shir of base kur? A person is not interested in purchasing one sada that really divides up into 2 or 3 sados that are separated one from the other because of the nekayim. The nekayim separate part of the sada from another part of the sada. And even though these nekayim are re'uyim lizriya, but nevertheless there's a tircha gedola to be choresh and zorea and kotzer in 2 sados. It's much easier, obviously, to plow, plant, and harvest in 1 sada. So therefore, the Kona, the Lekeach, had in mind, his intention was to buy a base kur without Nekayim, where it's one continuous field that's not divided up into many different fields that would cause him to be matriach himself in Charisha Zriya and Ktsira. Therefore, it matters not whether it's royal Zriya, meaning there's no water in the Nekayim, or it's Eino royal Zriya. So now that we've distinguished and contrasted the din of Hegdesh with the din of Mechira with regard to a base kur, if it has Nekayim that are more than Asar Tfachim, but they aren't royal Izriya, or they are royal Izriya. With regard to Hegdesh, if it's not royal Izriya, then it's separated as a separate entity. With regard to Mecher, even if it's not royal Izriya, I'm sorry, the other way around. Even if it's royal Izriya and it's not Moli Mayim, nevertheless it separates the Sada into 2 and the Mecher is butter. Hachamai. Now we have two paradigms. We've got the model of Hegdesh. We have the model of Mechira. Where do we fit in Kiddushin? A man is Mekadesh a woman on the condition that he owns, he's the proud possessor of a real estate that is the Shir of Beis Kur. Lehegdesh medhamina le, o lemecher medhamina le. Shall we compare the din of Kiddushay Isha and the Tanai that he stipulated to the laws of Hegdesh, which means that the Nekayim, if they're full of water and they're not royal Lizriya, then they separate themselves from the Sada, and therefore they cannot be Ola to a base Kur. Or should we compare Kiddushin and the Tanai therein to Mecher, which means that even if these Nekayim are totally empty, no water, and they're royal Lizriya, nevertheless, they're not integrated to the shear to fulfill the condition that I own a base Kur. And the Gemara answers, Mistabra Hegdesh Medamina, which means it all depends upon whether these Nekayim are full of water or they're not full of water. If they're not full of water, then they become royal Lizriya, and then we apply the pasuk of Zerach Chomer Sior, Zerah. And that principle that we cannot integrate the Nekayim into the base Kur for the purpose of Pediyah is going to be Kovea even in the case of Kiddushin. In the case of Mecher, we said that the Nekayim are not mitztarf and they separate the field into parts, and the buyer doesn't want to get a Sada that has like 2 or 3 parts to it because of the tircha that's involved. But here, that taina in regard to Kiddushin is not relevant. The Amr Allah, the Baal says to the Isha, not tarachna v'zarana u'maisida. You don't have to worry about the fact that there are Nekayim in the field and that the field is being separated into different parts. It's still one field of a base Kur. And I fulfilled my condition. I provided you with a field that's a base Kur. I, the Nekayim, I'm going to have to jump over the Nekayim back and forth and dance and be matriach with the Zriya and the Harisha and so forth and so on. No, I'll do all that work for you. You don't have to worry about that work. As far as you're concerned, it's one continuous field, and therefore the Kiddushin is Chal. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Samach Aleph. The Mishnah is going to present a machlokas tanoim about what we call a Tnai Kaful. And it all depends upon how to interpret the psukim in the parsha at the end of Bamidbar called B'nai Gad u'B'nai Ruven Bamidbar Lamed Beis. After B'nai Yisrael conquered the land of Gilad and Ever Yarden on the eastern side, B'nai Gad and B'nai Ruven come forward and they want to receive their nachla, their chelik amongst the Shiftei Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. They're willing to forego their rights to a chelik in Eretz Yisrael in exchange for land in Gilad. Moshe Rabbeinu accepts their proposal, and he's prepared to shift their rights from Eretz Yisrael to Eretz Gilad, Me'ever Yarden, on the condition that they will go chalutzim lifnei acheim lemilchama. And by the way, in the next week or two, we'll probably hear a lot about who are going to be the chalutzim to go first into Aza in the Milchemes Kibush Aza. But we're talking now about the Kibush of Eretz Yisrael. And Vayomer Moshe Aleim, in Yavru, B'nai Gad, B'nai Ruven, Itchem Es Hayardei, Kol Chalutzim L'Chavtei Hashem, and It B'Shar, It's Lifneim. Then, Unesatem, Lahem is Eretz Gilad Lachuz. V'im lo Yavru Chalutzim, Moshe Rabbeinu adds, V'noach Hazu B'Sochem B'Eretz Canaan. They will inherit a land in Eretz Canaan. They will have violated the Tanai, and they don't have rights to Gilad. Rabbi Meir, Omer called Tanai Shenu Kaful, Tanai B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven Tanai B'nai Gad u'B'nai Reuven, Moshe Rabbeinu is setting the standard, the regulations for a valid Tanai. And you need kfelus. And what does that mean, Tanai Kaful? Moshe Rabbeinu says, Im Tavru, then is Nichbish on the Satem as Eretz Gilad Lachuza. But Im Lo Yavru Chalutzim, then V'no Chazu, No Chazu B'Sochem B'Eretz Knan. Shenemar Uksivim Lo Yavru Chalutz. Who disagrees with Rabbi Meir and drops the requirement of Tanai Kaful and validates the Tanai even if he wasn't Kaful the Tanai? That's Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. We don't derive from the language of the Tanai that Moshe Rabbeinu was Masna that every single Tanai has to be Kaful, because in the case of Tanai B'nai Gad u'B'nai Reuven, there was a separate reason why Moshe had to be Kaful the Tanai. Tzorech hadavar liomro. He had to say that Im lo yavru chalutzim, then they will inherit the land in Eretz Canaan. Why? Il Molekain, if Moshe Rabbeinu hadn't added that second stipulation, yesh b'mashma, we'd have come to the mistaken conclusion, shafilu be'Eretz Canaan lo yinchalu. That the fact that they didn't go out chalutzim means that Eretz Canaan was mos be'eneihem, and therefore they don't even deserve a chelek in Eretz Canaan, and how much more so that they don't deserve a chelik in Gilad, which they so desired because they didn't go forward in the battle. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu says explicitly that if they don't go chalutzim, they're not going to be mafsid their entire chelik. It doesn't undermine their entire rights to Eretz Canaan, but rather they'll take part in Eretz Canaan as if they were any other shevet, and that's based on Gorol. So therefore, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel comes to the conclusion you can't derive Tanai Kafel here if there was a need for Moshe Rabbeinu to add the second part of the Tanai Kafel. But in a general rule, when you don't have a special need to add the imlav, then we apply the principle of mitoch lav atashomea hen. Frek the Gemara Shapir ka'amalei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Rabbi Meir. Why did Rabbi Meir insist that he could build his case and derive his principle of Tanai Kafel from the parsha of Moshe Rabbeinu with B'nai Gad B'nai Reuven? After all, Moshe Rabbeinu had to be Kafel the Tanai, not because of the Tanai, but simply to make sure that we understand that the B'nai Gad B'nai Reuven will inherit a land, a parcel of land like any other the other Shvatim in Eretz Canaan, even if they don't fulfill the condition. Rabbi Meir, if the pasuk is not going to teach me Tanai Kafel, then Lichtov, the Torah should have written the Im lo Yavru v'nochazu b'sochachem. And in the pasuk there are two extra words at the end of the pasuk. And after it says v'nochazu b'tochachem, it says b'eretz Knan. I'll read to you the whole pasuk. Im lo Yavru chalutzim itchem v'nochazu b'tochachem b'eretz Knan. And here we turn to Daf Samach Aleph Amid Beis.